Hey, guess what, everybody? Yeah, it is Jimmy Nuts. This is the Fantasy Network, but it's a time. It's Tad time. That's right, Tad Williams is back here on the Fantasy Network because we're going to be reviewing The War of the Flowers. This is not something that was on my TBR at all for this year, but I decided to read it because I was invited to a read along with Chris from Chris Bookish Cauldron and Andy Smith from the channel called, well, Andy Smith. So I will make sure their channels are linked in like the little info tile here so you can go check out their stuff. Two of my favorite channels for sure. And I couldn't turn down a chance to talk books with them while also reading one of my favorite authors. Now, to give you an idea, The War of the Flowers is so much different than Memory Sorrow and Thorn because it's really a portal fantasy adult fairy tale, and that is really two things that I haven't delved into much as a reader. And I love the premise of basically another world for a person who is way down on their luck and has connections to this other world and then ends up being sucked into a situation that they had no idea was unraveling in another world. This was an absolute delight. I hope that the other two gentlemen who read this with me feel the same because I could rant about this forever and ever and ever, and I hope that I am not seeming hyperbolic when I say the things I'm going to say during this review, but I want to get this out there now. And I know Andy kind of feels this way, at least where he's at with his read along. I think War of the Flowers is maybe the best fantasy standalone that I have read. We're following a main protagonist, kind of what I talked about before of someone down on their luck. Well, his name's Theo, and Theo is a bit of a mess up. He is kind of chasing a rock star dream. He's always had a knack for singing. He's 30, he has a girlfriend, and she is pregnant, and he needs to get his life together, and he needs to start putting food on the table and money in his pocket. He needs to quit staying out so late and drinking, basically chasing a dream and pretending he's still 18 or 21. But it's time for him to grow up. Now, a lot of unfortunate circumstances do fall upon Theo as the story goes on. I'm not going to give away any spoilers here at all, so you'll have to read and find out. But just trust me when I say that even though Theo can be a little bit frustrating, some of the things that happen to him in the story, especially early on, are very, very difficult to understand unless if you know someone or been through it yourself. And Theo is a very sympathetic protagonist because of that. It's very real, it's very gritty, and it's very based in reality. And that's one of the things what The World of Flowers does very well. And a lot of people do Portal Fantasy and they jump you right into the world, you get a brief introduction, but we spent a lot of time in our world, the real world, Theo's world. And because of that, I think we got more attached to Theo as a protagonist and also his situation. Tad also does something very well here where he has chapters that don't make a whole lot of sense and there's not a lot of context given around it and introduces you to characters that are on the other side of said portal. And it's really confusing at first, but if you just trust the process and know Tad for what Tad does, and that's tie up loose ends, by the end of the story, everything that felt like it was super out of context and super random ends up coming into this nice bowed package. And he was able to do that with Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, and he does it here again with this book. War of the Flowers is also very approachable. I think Tad has some of the best prose in all of fantasy, but it did not feel as obtuse as Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, which was definitely like a derivative of Tolkien, and I think he was trying to write in a Tolkien-esque way, if you will. This feels, while still being super rich with prose, it doesn't feel nearly as dense, which I think is a good thing, especially for a standalone. Tad's world building has always been super strong, and it stays very, very strong here in this story. We go to the portal world, we have our normal world, but the distinction between the two is something that he explores a lot, and it's one of the best parts of this standalone novel. For instance, when Theo's in the magical world, which is basically fairyland, by the way, there's fairies, there's bridge trolls, and there's even goblins that play jazz, which was just such an amazing thing. Just to touch on the world building and the setting, like it was so rich with magic and just like super not natural, but like super fantastical things. Like you don't see bridge trolls anymore. Like Tad wasn't afraid to lean into the old school fairy tales, and I think no one in the modern day pays more homage to like the old school fantasy slash fairy tale type things than Tad. And it's one of the things that give this such a personality. And like I'm beaming right now talking about it because it was just so much fun. So when Theo is in the fantasy world, he starts seeing like what's considered like magic in the fairy world, and then he's able to kind of relay back because things don't work exactly the same, right? So like there's a magic barcode scanner that then like taps into some sort of POS that sells things in the fairy world. And then he thinks about it, he's like, well, that's not so much different than like a credit card, right? So he's starting to realize that there's magic around him every day in his normal world. And there's magic for us, like my cell phone, right? That's tremendous. The coffee pot that brewed this for me. These things, the camera that's recording me right now and capturing me in a moment in time. There's magic all around. And Theo begins to realize all the things that he's, I wouldn't say taken for granted, but just overlooked and kind of takes for, yeah, I guess he does take it for granted because it is an achievement. It is magical. And technology, science, and all that stuff that we've used to further our world is kind of like magic. So Theo's getting exposed to the way things work in everyday fairyland that they don't think is a big deal, right? Like they're doing things the way they always do, and Theo thinks are mind blowing. For him to be able to relay that back to the real world, which we spent a lot of time in the first half of the novel, it's just awesome. It really builds a good relationship with Theo, and it makes us more appreciative as a reader for the setting that we're being put in. One of the strongest points of Tad's writing is the fact that Tad is super sly in getting the reader to think or ask the questions that he wants you to ask. He will intentionally put plot holes in his story to only then fill them 50 to 100 pages later in a very clever way. It's something he did do with Memory Sorrow and Thorn when I read, and he does it here again. And I just love that. I love whenever I'm having internal dialogue in my head trying to make sure that I'm understanding the story correctly because something just doesn't quite add up. And then Tad rewards you for your curiosity later down the line. The main conflict is interesting, but a lot of the other things that go into the main plot that end up being like almost side conflicts is really interesting. I think that I feel like the movie It Follows kind of has like an inspiration from this. Obviously, probably not, but there's like that kind of theme in this. If you've ever seen the horror movie It Follows, there's like a subplot that's going on that involves Theo that kind of feels like that movie in a way. And it's something that I feel I wish was explored a little bit more in other realms of even just fiction in general. I really like that movie's concept. I didn't necessarily think that movie was 5 stars, but the concept of that movie was so cool. And then to see that, played out here, and Tad wrote this in the late 90s and ended up getting it published in the early 2000s, is kind of cool. And I'm glad that concept was in here because it's just one that I find to be overtly interesting. Speaking of when Tad published this book, so there is an event in this book. Tad wrote this before September 11th, 2001, with obviously the attack on the World Trade Center that happened here in America. And it so happened that Tad wrote this beforehand, and there was an event in the book that was very eerily similar to what happened on September 11th. And because of that, he actually ended up having to go back and change that event in the book because I believe the publisher just didn't think it would be a good look for him or them. So he ended up changing it to something else. And when you get to that point in the book, you'll know what it is. And it's really impactful. And it's also just a really interesting backstory to this book. The fact that 9/11 had an impact on pieces of the plot in this book because Tad just so happened to have something kind of close to that. Kind of wild. I think it's in the foreword of the book if you get the ebook. But just a little piece of, little nugget of knowledge for you about the World of Flowers and the publishing process that he went through. I think this was supposed to release in like 2000 or 2001. Ended up not getting published in 2003 or 4, I believe, because of the revisions that had to be made. So going into something that I did find to be a little bit of a negative, in part 4, Theo has a outstanding, outrageous, a really good moment. And it's huge for not just the character development of Theo and his backstory, but also for the plot of the book. And it's very well written. So I'm not saying that everything in this book is so well written. Every sentence is crafted beautifully, and also like the points of that moment are very good. I like what Tad gave us, but the way that it was relayed to us felt super info dumpy. Like I'm talking pages and pages and pages of a monologue that just kind of felt not natural in a way. And I know we're in fairyland, we can get away with those type of things, but that's the only part of the book that kind of took me out a little bit. And I just remember kind of stepping back and being like, man, this is like a truly long monologue going on from Theo and a different character. And it was a very important moment. It had to happen, but I feel like maybe it could have been broken up a little bit or maybe condensed. It just felt very, very long. And that's really the only con I have. This book really got put over the edge by the fact that it's an adult fairy tale, and it's very much adult, and it's also very much a fairy tale. You're in a fairy world, there's like silly things like bridge trolls and goblins playing jazz. There's like a really cool nightclub scene, like just really random stuff, right? That's fun. But then an intense moment will come, and Tad will deliver on that moment and make it so impactful that you just end up realizing, oh, there's like stakes here at play, and this is not your normal, before bedtime fairy tale that your mom and dad tell you. It's very real, and it's grounded somehow in reality, in of consequences that we can understand, and the conflict is so well done here. And Tad has excelled in that in every book I've ever read of his. So yeah, I think that this story over encompassing, and I can't get into a lot of the plot because I don't want to give anything away. I will just say, if you got to get to 50%, I mean, just the way that Tad drops some of the most impactful moments where he does in the story, kind of come out of nowhere in a bit, but there's like a crescendo to the book, really like 2 times, and both of them are so well done. I love it. The execution is damn near flawless, and I would say this is a phenomenal place to start with Tad Williams. If you read The Dragonbone Chair, or maybe you didn't want to get into Memory Sorrow and Thorn because it's so cumbersome, this is a better place to start with Tad Williams. This is going to be where I start pointing people whenever they want to know more about Tad and why people love him so much. I think as of today, this is my favorite fantasy standalone novel, and I really mean that. I've read some really good ones, but the scope of this, it felt like it could have been dragged on into a trilogy or a multi-book series. I loved that this was a standalone. I know Andy and Chris both said that. It's nice to feel like a book that doesn't feel like it got neutered or chopped too soon. This is a book with a very rich world, rich character building. It has everything that one of the big, epic fantasy series have, but it's all in one book. And it is a longer book. I think it's 800 pages or something. I read it on Kindle, so I was just moseying through it, and I didn't really have the thickness to judge against his other works. But the fact that it's a standalone, you get a very, very compelling story that is wrapped up maybe perfectly, in my opinion. This is, without a doubt, one that you should give a shot, and I don't think anyone would shy away from saying that it's a good time. Yes, it is an adult fairy tale. If that's not your thing, I guess maybe shy away from it. I'm not huge into portal fantasy. Though maybe I am just not as experienced as I should be, and I definitely don't generally go for adult fairy tales. But this is something that I just feel most people will enjoy. But this is also a book that I have thought about. I read this a couple weeks ago. I have thought about this so much. I have loved hearing Andy and Chris's insights as they go through it. I finished it first because I'm a madman and just read like 150 pages a day because I love Tad so much. But this is a book I will think about for years to come, and it'll be a book that stands out in my memory as one of my most favorite and unique and just really, really rich with good character moments, funny moments, sad moments, impactful moments. So this is a book that is going to be in high contention for one of my favorite reads of the year. Might have been the best book I read this past month. There's a lot of stiff competition there, but that's not the video. This is not the video for me to talk about that. What I do know is that I recommend The War of the Flowers by Tad Williams, and I think it's an amazing entry point to get into Tad's writing, and I think you'll have a lot of fun. Hey, thank you so much for listening to me talk and rant and review about The War of the Flowers by Tad Williams. If you're going to check it out, let me know down in the comments, or if you have read it. Again, I think that if you're looking to dive into Tad and you don't want to make the commitment to Memory Sorrow and Thorn, this is the place to start. If you like this video, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. You can turn on the bell notification. I will definitely have more Tad Williams here on the channel. I just wrapped up Memory Sorrow and Thorn 2 months ago, and I'm already back into his stuff. Otherland's coming, and I gotta do Last King of Ostenard. So there will be more Tad content here on the channel. So until the next time I see you, be safe, be good, and remember to always keep turning the page.